So, having said that, what
One way or another.
are your concerns, John?
Well, first of all, I don't think that 95% of the lobbying that's done affects democracy at all. I don't think it matters whether we buy a Lockheed fighter or a Boeing fighter. It matters to Lockheed and Boeing, but does it really affect democracy when they're lobbying back and forth on which fighter we should buy or which transport we should buy? So, and there's an awful lot of lobbying like that. I think, however, that there needs to be a lot more transparency around these. In other words, and a lot more ethical rules surrounding behavior, not of lobbyists per se. Again, the debate right now in Washington is who's at fault, the lobbyists that bribe or the people who accept the bribes. And I think that it's got to come down on both sides. So the only way you have that is by transparency and by ethical guidelines in terms of what is acceptable behavior, in terms of accepting. If you're a public official, what can you accept and what can you not accept? And that has to be clear, it has to be concise, and it has to be acceptable. And it can't be subjective as the government continuously tries to do. Well, it's up to the deputy, or if you've got a letter up from the deputy saying that it's okay, or the standard line is anybody who thinks that a $250 dinner or a bottle of wine is going to convince me how I'm going to vote, really ought to have their head examined. Well, I don't accept that. I don't care whether it's a $250 or a $150 or a $50 bottle of wine. It shouldn't be a bottle of wine in the first instance. So, on that score, I think that there's still. I think you can lobby. You can put forward your points. You can argue why your product or your issue should be acceptable or better than the others. And the more people who are doing that, the better off we are. The more competition you have of ideas, I think the better off. The question is, under what conditions is that competition taking place? And I still have concerns about those conditions. In terms of I too share some of Duff's concerns about where is the line? How can you, in a sense, work for a party or work for a candidate, and then on the other hand, lobby that candidate? That whole ethical line, I tend to look a lot more at the American situation than the Canadian situation, because quite frankly, there's a lot more going on there, and it isn't all good by any stretch. It's really quite deplorable what happens in other jurisdictions. But there is a moving ethical line. There's no clear morality here. It's moving. Morality is shifting, and it is moving more towards, Lord, I hope it is anyway, more clear rules, more transparency, and less I hesitate to use the word graft or bribes or anything like that, but I mean, it's there. There's a lot of money. I mean, if you I don't know whether I put it here, but if you go on the American website, Center for Public Integrity, the amount of money that is being spent in Washington now on these issues is just gross, and that is just lobbying. That is not the campaign contributions and the like, which are just pumping in there.
Yeah, that is a key transparency gap in Canada, is that there isn't a disclosure of how much is being spent. No lobbyist has to disclose, even in round figures, how much they are spending on campaigns. But we do have a saving grace in a way, in that we have spending limits on elections. And
campaign contribution limits.
And we have donation limits.
Yeah.
and there are some loopholes, but not anything like the U.S. system, especially on the spending limit side. And so, I mean, we do have a line, really, that we'll see what the Ethics Commissioner and Lobbying Commissioner do. And just to pick up on one of John's points, I agree. There is a bit of redundancy. You don't actually need the rules for both sides, the lobbyists and the public officials, and it's probably more appropriate, given that they're the ones who commit to upholding the public trust, to put it on the public officials. If you have a rule that they can't accept anything, well, then it's a rule, obviously, that the lobbyists can't give it either. And so if the lobbyists gave it, then I guess you can say, well, you should say that they can be found in violation of it, for giving it. But we have two different codes, and they've been interpreted pretty much the same way, which is lucky, because they could have interpreted a different way, and the lobbying commissioner could be saying it's okay for a lobbyist to give something to a minister, and have the ethics commissioner saying it's not okay for the minister to accept it. I mean, how would the two sides deal with that situation? So it would have been better sort of have one code that defined the relationship, but luckily we have interpretations that are pretty similar. But we also have this limit on donations, and it's donations of money, property, or services, and you can't donate more than $1,100 annually. Well, that's essentially the line that's been drawn. And that means, in a way, that you can't volunteer, right? You're not providing services as a business to a party or a candidate when you're volunteering to help out on a campaign, if you're doing so, volunteering in a way that is not your regular business. That's how it's defined under elections law. But at the same time, the suggestion is very strong under elections law that if you end up giving more than $1,100 worth of volunteer labor and services to a campaign, that's enough to cross the line and become a contribution that's too much, a contribution that would cause a conflict of interest. And that's what Democracy Watch has argued in a couple of complaints we filed recently, that the volunteer services that were provided, which are actually exempt from the donation limits, that the donation limits we have suggest strongly that volunteer services, volunteer labor, that it is has a market value of more than $1,100 annually, means that you've crossed the line and caused a conflict of interest. And therefore, especially if you're a lobbyist registered to lobby that minister, and you do that, then you've definitely created a conflict of interest that's illegal, and the minister would have to step aside, should be found in violation of accepting that gift. The lobbyist should be found in violation of giving it, and the minister would also have to step aside from taking part in any decisions that would affect that lobbyist or that lobbyist's clients.
But you can't do that because there's no provision for the minister to step aside in our system. And the minister he is the minister of that department, and if that department is doing something, it only does it under his or her signature. So I mean, I think you have to come down to the fact that these sorts of things, these relationships, whether it be because someone worked on your campaign or because he's your brother-in-law or some other family tie or whatnot, which I think is equally nefarious and is all over. Again, political families tend to be pretty small, and people do tend to work on both sides of the fence, and they do tend to have people inside and outside of government and the like. So I think in the end, it all has to boil down to you need transparency. You need